Hi Yogi, and welcome to another episode of Asana Lab with me, Oceana. In today's video, I'm going to talk you through the yoga alignment and anatomy of Warrior 1, Virabhadrasana 1. I'll initially start by taking you through lots of detail in terms of how to align the posture properly and what kind of muscle engagement you're looking for. And in the second part of the video, I will talk you through some practical exercises that will hopefully allow you to find your version of the pose that is accommodating to your specific body's proportions and needs. So before we get right into it, I just briefly want to touch on a couple of subjects with regards to this posture. Firstly, it was kind of a tricky video to put together. Warrior 1 was one of the only postures that when it came to taking our first practical teaching exam on my original training, nobody wanted to teach this pose because the more you know about it, the more complicated it gets. And that sort of leads me on to point number 2, which is that I personally, over several years of teaching, have decided that I now teach 2 different versions of this pose, and the version that I teach very much depends on what I'm trying to convey to my students in that particular class. So which muscles am I trying to get them to engage? Which sort of movements am I trying to get them to understand in different ways? All of that sort of factors into how I sequence my classes. And it's very important as well because I teach vinyasa flow, and vinyasa translates from Sanskrit as placing with intent. So not just placing our body intentionally into the postures, but also how we sequence the postures together. Each pose that you do is affected by the one that came before it as well as the one that comes after it. Because potentially in the one before it, you've engaged certain muscles or you've opened and stretched different parts of the body that then affects how the next posture works for you. So sequencing gets quite intricate and tricky very quickly. And so I'll talk you through both versions of the pose. I will say that one of them I use a lot more frequently than the other. And the other thing to say is that one of them is much more accommodating if you have experienced sacroiliac joint issues or lower back pain at any point. So I will mention that when we get to it. And finally, of course, there is quite a bit of overlap with Warrior 2 here. Not necessarily in terms of the actual alignment of the pose, is quite different. However, in terms of the experiential anatomy exercises, those are fairly similar. So, but it's always good to recap, but you may wish to skip that if you've already just recently watched Warrior 2. You can apply a lot of those same principles to this pose. So, as I suggested in our last video, my suggestion is always that initially when I go through the alignment, that you sit back and watch, allow me to demonstrate so that you actually see someone else's body in the posture, which I think can be quite helpful in understanding how to arrange yourself in the pose. So I'll start with my right foot forward, and I'm going to step, similar to Warrior 2, I'm going to step the left foot about a leg length back. Now, the first version of the pose that I'll teach you, this is the one I use less frequently. And I have to credit this version to Jason Crandell, who's quite a famous American yoga teacher. In this first version, key difference is that the heels are in one line, and this is traditional alignment. Traditionally, especially in Ashtanga yoga, you would really want to be going from Warrior 1 to Warrior 2 and do them very fluidly into reverse Warrior and maybe Virabhadrasana, etc. So it was always very important in Ashtanga that you could keep the heels in one line. However, the thing that was quite, let's say, tricky and also not particularly helpful for people who have Western body types with wider hips is that in Ashtanga, and I think in Iyengar as well, they would always ask you to square the hips towards the front of your mat. And I have to say, I'm hypermobile, and even I can't fully get my hips to square towards the front. So I'll talk you through Jason's little amendment here that allows you to still do the posture in the traditional way. But we'll start with our foundation. So the back foot is turned in by 45 degrees so that I can make sure that my back knee is pointing in the same direction as the back toes. I'm going to press through the outer edge of my back foot, strong engagement through the back leg. The front knee, if you're a traditionalist, is going to be bent at a 90-degree angle. And you'll be pressing down through the front heel as well as the front big toe and pinky toe. In terms of the front knee, it wants to be tracking over the second and third toe. And then there's a sense that your hips are very much centered between your legs. There's equal amounts of weights distributing into both feet so that your body is centered and the hips can feel a really strong sense of stability and grounding. The back leg is internally rotated and the front knee for most people will be just a touch externally rotated here. And I'll show you the back view of this pose. Jason actually, it's quite helpful. Jason refers to this version as Warrrior 1.5 because it's sort of a halfway house between traditional Warrrior 1 and Warrrior 2. And I think that's an interesting and helpful distinction to make. So I'm going to have the left leg forward to give you the back view. I'll step the right foot all the way back, make sure that the heels are in one line, and I've got about one leg length distance. I'm going to arrange my legs the exact same way as I did before. And now I'm going to show you the key difference. So in traditional yoga, we would really have to pull this left hip really far back so that we can pull the right hip forward and square the hips towards the front of the mat. And as I said, even for me, I don't think this is possible. And I have never seen anyone fully square their hips in Warrrior 1, sorry. So what Jason suggests is that actually where your hips start to meet resistance, which for me is here, that is where you stop. And so your torso is sort of halfway between being fully squared and facing towards the side of your mat as it would be in a Warrrior 2. So for me, that actually means that my torso is now facing the front right corner of my mat. And this allows me to have enough space in the lower back to feel that I'm not crunching into my hips, into my sacroiliac joint. I'm not compressing the lumbar spine too much. And this version of the pose gets very deep into the adductor muscle in your thigh, which is sort of the inner upper thigh muscle that connects your hip bone into your pelvis. So that is Jason's version. And then in terms of the upper body, you would really, as before with Warrrior 2, you try to knit the ribs together. Slightly different here as well is that in traditional yoga, you would have your palms touching and maybe the head behind your biceps so that you can gaze up at your thumbs. And I would personally suggest that actually having your hands sort of at least shoulder distance, if not slightly wider, with the pinky fingers spinning in. So you have your shoulders wrapping forward and around. And the gaze either forward or lifted between the hands is a much more forgiving variation for the shoulders, and in my opinion feels a lot better. I feel that I could stay here a lot longer than I could here. So that is Warrrior 1.5. And the only time I really use Warrrior 1.5 is if I'm asking students to go directly from Warrrior 1 to Warrrior 2 and vice versa, which I very rarely sequence that way, so it doesn't happen too often. Now I'll take you through my other version of Warrrior 1. And this is the version that we were taught to teach on my first foundational yoga teacher training. The reason I said it like that is because, they always tell you that for the sake of your exam, you have to teach it this way. But I do find that this is a really useful way of teaching Warrrior 1. And I will say sort of my general distinction is as well, if I will teach Warrrior 1.5, if I'm emphasizing movement across the sagittal plane of movement, so along the edge of the mat, which includes Warrrior 2, Warrrior 1.5, things like Skandasana or goddess pose, These are all along the sagittal plane, so deep hip opening in many ways. If I'm emphasizing movement across the frontal plane here, so facing the front of the mat, which would be flexion and extension of the hips, for instance, would also include inversions such as forearm balance or handstands, then I would teach this version of Warrior One. And the important difference here is that in this version, you keep your feet hip distance apart. So you don't have the heels in one line, but the heels are separated from one another. So instead of being about here, you're more here. And because there is that space between the feet, this now gives you the space to very comfortably square your hips to the front of the mat. So I'll show you that now. We'll start with the right foot in front, and I'm going to step the left foot back. Again, I'm going to aim for about a leg length, could be slightly shorter. The foot alignment is exactly the same. The only difference is here that my right foot is a little bit more towards the outer edge of the mat. Both feet are slightly away from the center of the mat. And from here, I'm able to much more easily square my hips to the front of the room. I can even have my hands on top of my hip joints to really feel that they're facing forward like two headlights on a car. And then again, I'm knitting the ribs in, and I can lift the hands up towards the ceiling and really feel a strong engagement along either side of my spine. I can soften the shoulders. And again, I'll show you that on the second side so that you get a 360-degree view. So I'll step the right foot back. Again, nice deep bend on the front knee. Squaring the hips towards the front of the mat, really pressing through the outer edge of the back foot and gently reaching the arms up. And I would also say that this version has slightly different muscular engagement. I think it's more easy to feel the front and back of the body connecting here, and it also has a deeper stretch on the back of my leg here. I feel it a lot more strongly in my back calf, as well as the Achilles tendon, whereas the other posture emphasizes more the muscles. It still stretches the muscles in the back leg, but more in the front of your back quad. So that's the main differences. And I'll talk you through the same exercises that we did for Warrior 2, but they are slightly different in this pose because, of course, the alignment's slightly different. I would suggest that you play around a little bit with your foot positioning to see which you prefer. And maybe, like me, you like to actually vary your Warrior 1 and 1.5. So let's start with the right foot forward. We'll start with the heels in one line. So let's step the left foot about a leg length back. We'll spin the heel away from us with the toes pointing in 45 degrees. And from here, again, similar to Warrior 2, we'll bend the back knee so that we can really feel the energy and the muscular engagement that we need in the back leg to really support ourselves here and keep the torso equally balanced between both legs. And we can straighten and bend the front knee to feel the engagement in the front leg, and also see if we can track the front knee over second and third toe. And if tracking the knee seems almost impossible, then you could lift the front heel, and again here you have a lot more freedom of movement. You can find the knee, the center of your kneecap right on top of those toes, and then release the heel back down when you're ready. And then here, you want a sense that your front ribs are knitting in towards one another. And it's helpful to understand that by placing the hands just on the lower rib cage here. Really flare your ribs out, lift the chest, and spread your fingertips nice and wide. And then as you exhale, see if you can draw the hands together so the fingers are almost trying to interlace like a corset. And again, as you inhale, open the chest, really puff it out, and exhale to draw the ribs in. We'll do that one final time. Open the chest as you inhale, and exhale to knit everything in. And see if you can also get a little sense of your lower ribs. Stick your thumbs onto the lower ribs, and then see if your middle finger can find your frontal hip points here. and have a sense that those are drawing towards one another. So the front of the body is closed off. And then from here, reach the arms up. Bring the middle fingers to touch above your head with the backs of the hands spinning up. Elbows are nice and bent. And then have a little twist side to side. And see where you feel that resistance in the hip joint. And once you find that resistance, maybe like me, you're facing towards the left frontal corner of your mat. Then release the arms all the way up. Maybe lift the gaze if you wish. And gently bend the front knee to step your back foot in. And we'll move on to the second side. So again, initially we'll start with the heels in one line. And we'll come back to do the second variation. We'll step the foot back one leg length or a little bit less. From here, start with the hands on the hips. You can bend your back knee first. Have a little sense of the pressure needed to press through the outer edge of your back foot, and then straighten and bend the front knee. See if you can directly track it over the second and third toe. And if that's tricky, then lift your front heel so that you can adjust the knee and then place it back down when you're ready. Again, hands are going to go onto the lower ribs, so the index and thumb are pressing into the lower ribs. As you inhale, flare the ribs, really arch the spine. As you exhale, draw the fingertips towards one another. Inhale to flare the ribs and exhale to knit everything together. And final time. Really roll the shoulders back. Exhale to knit together. Good. From here again, we'll have the middle fingers touching, backs of the hands towards the ceiling. Allow the shoulders to drop, and then have a sense that your right elbow is reaching back. And then spin the left elbow all the way towards your left side of the mat. And do that a few times so that you come into this rotation in the upper body. And once you find that resistance towards your left rib cage and hip, then release the arms up towards the ceiling, soften the shoulders down the back, spin the pinky fingers in. Maybe lift the gaze. Press through both feet equally. On an exhale, bring the hands down by your side, come onto the ball of the back foot and step all the way forward. So that's our Warrior 1.5. Now notice if you were already feeling some kind of pinching in the lower back or sacral area, so that sort of triangular bone that sits right above your bottom, the very base of the spine, might be a more polite way of saying it. And from here, in mountain pose, stand with your feet hip distance. And then notice how wide that distance is. See if you can sort of almost get a sense of where your feet are on the mat in terms of the distance to the outer edges of your mat. And gently bend your right knee. From here, we'll come into the other version of Warrior 1. So we'll step the left foot back. We'll spin the back heel down and turn the toes in by 45 degrees. Now, if you find that squaring the hips towards the front of the mat is already tricky, then walk your right foot a little bit more towards the outer edge of the mat. Again, from here, the ribs are drawing in. The arms sweep up and overhead. You're pressing through both feet equally, tracking the front knee over the second and third toes, maybe lifting the gaze. And then here we're going to pretend to screw in light bulbs on the ceiling so that you start to connect the dots to that rotation of the pinky fingers moving in towards each other. And then with the pinky fingers really drawing in towards each other, the shoulders wrap forward and around, and that is your arm position. Exhale, bring the hands back to your hips, tuck your back toes under, come onto the ball of the back foot to step all the way forward. Allow your body to briefly settle in mountain pose. And we'll do our final side here, so we'll shift the weight into the left foot, we'll step the right foot all the way back. We'll spin the back heel down. And again, if it's tricky to square the hips forward, you shimmy the front foot a little bit towards the left outer edge of the mat. Hands can be on the hips so that you feel your hip points, those pokey bits at the front of your hips, really squaring towards the front. Pressing through the outer edge of the back foot. And gently lifting the arms. Seeing if you can maintain that knitted action of your ribs at the front of the body. And again here, we spin the thumbs away from each other, the pinky fingers move in so that we get that engagement in the shoulder joint. And eventually hold that pose just briefly, really press through the legs. Feel into that alignment, remember what that feels like for yourself, for your body. Does this feel better than version 1? Really inquire into the sensations that you're experiencing. And then slowly bring the hands to the hips, come onto the ball of the back foot and step yourself all the way forward. Now, the only thing I would also add is that if you deal with high blood pressure or hypertension, you would ideally not hold your arms statically over your head for long periods of time, but maybe you would move the arms in different ways, so allow yourself some freedom to move in the poses, or you could keep the hands on your hips, which is helpful because it allows you to really feel into the pelvis, keeping it square and keeping it really steady and stable. And that's sort of one of the main contraindications of the pose. I would also say, similar to Warrior II, there isn't a whole lot you can do in terms of adjusting it. The easiest way always, especially if you're in a group class, is to simply adjust the distance of your feet or to take the feet a little bit wider, which is helpful for balance because it gives you a wider base, of course. And again, similar to Warrior II, you can do this as a chair yoga pose by simply sliding the seat of a chair underneath your front hip so that your front thigh is supported by the chair. And if the front thigh is a little bit too high up, then you pad it out with some cushions and pillows and bolsters, etc., so that you really have a sense that you can allow some of that weight in the front leg to come down, and it takes a little bit of pressure off the front foot. So hopefully those are some helpful modifications that you could apply to your practice. Of course, if you have postures that you would ideally like me to cover in this same way, then please pop those in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends and family. It really, really helps me. And of course, if you enjoyed it, then I hope to see you back here next week for another episode of Asana Labs, and hope you have a fabulous week before then. Thank you so much for joining me, Yogi. Bye.